The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March 2024, cutting through the desert silence like a blade through silk. Detective Madison Clark had been staring at the ceiling of her Phoenix apartment, counting the shadows cast by streetlights filtering through Venetian blinds, when the shrill tone jolted her upright. 18 years on the force had trained her body to respond to that sound with military precision, even when her mind was elsewhere, which, lately, it always was. "Clark," she answered, her voice harsh from another sleepless night. "Madison, it's Captain Rodriguez. I need you at the lab now." The urgency in his voice sent ice through her veins. Captain Miguel Rodriguez was a 25-year veteran who had seen everything the desert could serve up, from cartel violence to domestic nightmares that would make hardened cops weep in their cars afterward. Nothing rattled him anymore. Nothing except, is this about the Brennan case? Madison's bare feet were already touching the cold hardwood floor, muscle memory guiding her toward the jeans draped over her bedroom chair. The Brennan case. Even saying those words aloud felt like invoking something sacred and terrible, like speaking the name of a ghost you weren't sure you wanted to see. CODIS got a hit. Full profile match. After 18 goddamn years, Madison. 18 years. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the nightstand before she caught it. CODIS, the combined DNA index system, had been their last hope, their final prayer cast into the digital void. For nearly 2 decades, the DNA sample from the Brennan family massacre had sat in databases across the country, a silent sentinel waiting for its twin to surface. Blood from underneath Jennifer Brennan's fingernails, evidence that she had fought, that she had clawed at her killer with the desperate fury of a mother protecting her children. Madison's hands trembled as she pulled on her jacket, the same worn leather bomber that had been her armor through countless crime scenes, countless sleepless nights, countless families destroyed by violence that defied explanation. The Brennan case had been her first as lead detective, handed to her in 2006 when she was 32 and still believed that justice was inevitable, that truth always surfaced, that monsters always got caught. She had been so young then, so certain. The drive to the Phoenix Police Department crime lab took her through neighborhoods that held the memory of that terrible summer like scars in the landscape. Past the elementary school where Tommy Brennan should have started 3rd grade, past the church where the family's memorial service had been held, where hundreds of people had packed the pews to mourn a family that had been by all accounts ordinary in the most beautiful way. Jennifer Brennan, 34, a kindergarten teacher whose students made her handmade cards that still sat in evidence boxes. David Brennan, 36, a construction foreman who coached Little League on weekends and never missed his daughter's dance recitals. Sophia, 6 years old, who wanted to be a veterinarian and collected stuffed animals with the intensity of a museum curator. Tommy, 8, who played piano and dreamed of becoming an astronaut. All of them found on that scorching July morning in 2006, their suburban ranch house transformed into a tableau of horror that had haunted Madison's dreams for 18 years. The lab was buzzing with activity despite the late hour. She could see the excitement crackling through the fluorescent-lit corridors like electricity before a storm. Dr. Sarah Chin, the forensic DNA analyst, met her at the entrance, her usually immaculate lab coat wrinkled from what had clearly been hours of frenzied work. "Madison, you're not going to believe this," Sarah said, her voice pitched high with adrenaline. "The profile that came back, it's not just a match, it's a perfect match. 16 markers, all identical. The probability of this being anyone other than our killer is 1 in several billion." They walked together through the familiar maze of equipment and computer stations, past the spectrometers and centrifuges that had become the modern temples of justice. Madison had spent more time in this lab than in her own living room over the past 18 years, watching as technology evolved, as techniques improved, as hope flickered and dimmed, and somehow managed to survive. "Who is he?" Madison asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. After 18 years of building a phantom in her mind, a shadow figure responsible for destroying the most innocent family she had ever encountered, the prospect of putting a name and face to that evil felt almost surreal. Marcus Webb, 47 years old, currently serving a 15-year sentence in Tucson for armed robbery and assault. He's been in the system since 2019. Sarah handed Madison a manila folder thick with documents. But here's the thing, Madison. This isn't his first rodeo. I ran his record while we waited for you. Multiple arrests dating back to 2003. Domestic violence, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon. The pattern was there. We just never connected it to our case. Madison opened the folder with hands that had steadied through years of practice, but still shook slightly when confronted with the possibility of closure. Marcus Webb's mugshot stared back at her, a face that she didn't recognize but somehow felt she had been searching for her entire adult life. Thin lips, hollow cheeks, eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. This was the man who had destroyed the Brennan family. This was the monster she had been chasing for 18 years. There's more, Sarah continued, leading Madison to a computer workstation where DNA profiles glowed on the monitor like digital fingerprints. I cross-referenced his profile with other unsolved cases in Arizona. We might have connected him to 2 additional home invasions from 2005 and 2007. Both families, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, both ending the same way. The weight of those words settled on Madison's shoulders like a lead blanket. 3 families, possibly more. How many lives had been destroyed while Marcus Webb walked free, while the system failed to connect the dots, while she had lain awake night after night wondering if she had missed something, if she could have worked harder, been smarter, saved someone. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor cracked with something that looked like relief mixed with exhaustion. Madison, I know this is a lot to process, but we need to move fast. Webb's scheduled for parole review next month. If we're going to charge him, we need everything locked down tight. No mistakes, no loopholes for some defense attorney to exploit. Madison nodded, her mind already shifting into the methodical mode that had carried her through nearly a decade of police work. Evidence chain, interviewed witnesses, case reconstruction, all the pieces that would need to fit together perfectly to ensure that Marcus Webb never walked free again. But underneath the professional calculations, something else was stirring, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, something that felt dangerously close to hope. I want to see him, she said quietly. I want to look him in the eye and tell him you know what he did to the Brennans, to all of them. Sarah and Captain Rodriguez exchanged a glance that Madison couldn't quite interpret. There would be protocols to follow, procedures to observe, but after 18 years of carrying the weight of unsolved murders, of facing Jennifer Brennan's mother at every anniversary memorial, of explaining to journalists and true crime podcasters why justice remained elusive, Madison had felt she had earned the right to confront the man who had haunted her professional life. The clock on the lab wall read 1:23 a.m. In a few hours, the sun would rise over the Arizona desert, illuminating another day in a case that had seemed destined to remain forever in shadow. But something had shifted in the universe tonight. Some cosmic balance had been restored. Madison Clark closed the folder containing Marcus Webb's information and felt, for the first time in 18 years, like she could breathe fully. The Brennan family was about to get their justice, and Madison was going to make sure they got every piece of it they deserved. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Madison had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since July 15, 2006. She knew this with the precision of someone who had been documenting her own unraveling for nearly 2 decades, marking each restless night in a journal that had grown into a collection of 17 identical black notebooks, each filled with the kind of obsessive detail that separates dedicated cops from those who simply show up for a paycheck. The morning after the DNA breakthrough, she sat at her kitchen table with notebook number 18 open before her, writing in the careful script she had developed to combat the tremor that had crept into her hands somewhere around year 10 of the investigation. March 14, 2024. CODIS hit confirmed. Marcus Webb. This is the beginning of the end. Her apartment reflected the single-minded focus that had consumed her life since taking lead on the Brennan case. Every wall held photographs, timelines, maps, and diagrams related to unsolved homicides, with the Brennan family materials forming a shrine-like centerpiece in what should have been her living room. Visitors often commented that the space felt more like a war room than a home, and Madison never bothered to disagree. This had been her war, and she had been fighting it alone for longer than some of her colleagues had been alive. The coffee maker gurgled to life, the same Mr. Coffee machine she had owned since 2003, its white plastic exterior now yellowed with age and stained with the residue of thousands of early morning preparations for crime scenes that had blurred together into a singular mission: bring justice to families who had been torn apart by violence. Jennifer Brennan smiled at her from a dozen photographs arranged across the kitchen counter. School pictures, family portraits, candid shots from birthday parties and Christmas mornings that had been submitted as evidence to humanize the victims for potential juries. Madison had memorized every detail of these images. The way Jennifer's eyes crinkled when she laughed, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident, the silver bracelet she wore in every photo, a gift from her mother that had been found clutched in Sophia's small hand when the bodies were discovered. These details had become part of Madison's internal landscape, permanent residence in the space where other people kept memories of their own families, their own joy. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A text from Detective Ray Morrison, her current partner and the fifth person to fill that role since 2006. Webb's attorney is already making noise about constitutional violations. Rodriguez wants us in his office at 8. Madison smiled grimly. Of course Marcus Webb had already lawyered up. Men like him always did. Predators who understood the system well enough to game it, who knew that technicalities could matter more than truth in courtrooms where justice was supposed to be blind but often seemed merely blindfolded. She had watched too many cases crumble because of procedural mistakes, seen too many families devastated twice, once by the crime itself and again by a legal system that valued process over resolution. She showered with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had reduced every aspect of daily maintenance to its most essential components: soap, shampoo, conditioner. 3 minutes underwater, hot enough to punish, but not quite hot enough to scar. The ritual had remained unchanged since 2006, a small piece of control in a life that had largely been defined by chaos and uncertainty. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked older than her 50 years, though the aging had been so gradual that Madison sometimes felt surprised by her own reflection. Gray streaks had appeared in her dark hair around year 12 of the investigation, deepening into silver threads that she no longer bothered to color. Lines had etched themselves around her eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting at crime scene photos under fluorescent lights, from studying evidence boards until her vision blurred, from the constant tension of carrying unsolved murders like stones in her chest. Her mother called while Madison was getting dressed, a weekly ritual that had persisted despite the growing distance between them. "Mija, you sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just a busy week." Madison pulled on the same style of black pantsuit she had worn to work for the past decade, professional armor that eliminated the need to make decisions about appearance. Her mother worried, had been worrying since Madison's marriage had ended in 2010, another casualty of her obsession with cases that couldn't be solved, with victims who needed justice more than her ex-husband had needed a wife who came home for dinner. You know, Mrs. Guerrera from church has a nephew who's a teacher. Very nice boy, never married. Mom, I have to go. Work is calling. Madison ended the conversation with the gentle efficiency she had perfected, cutting off discussions about her personal life before they could take root. There was no personal life. There was only the work, and the work was everything. She parked in the same spot she had occupied for the past 8 years, space 47 in the employee lot, beneath a mesquite tree that provided shade during the brutal summer months. The tree had grown considerably since 2006, its branches now reaching across multiple parking spaces, offering protection that hadn't existed when she first arrived as a newly minted detective convinced that intelligence and persistence could solve any case. Detective Ray Morrison was waiting by the entrance, holding 2 cups of coffee from the gas station across the street. Ray was 28, eager, and reminded Madison of herself at that age, before the Brennan case had taught her that some puzzles don't have solutions, that some questions echo in darkness forever. He'd been assigned as her partner 6 months earlier, and unlike his predecessors, he hadn't requested a transfer when he realized that Madison's reputation for obsessiveness wasn't exaggerated. "You ready for this?" Ray asked, handing her one of the cups. His coffee was light and sweet, while hers was black enough to strip paint. The contrast had become a running joke between them, though Madison rarely found energy for humor anymore. "I've been ready for 18 years, Madison replied, taking the first sip of coffee that would fuel another day in service of the dead. "The question is whether the system is ready to finally do its job." They walked together through the familiar corridors of the police station, past bulletin boards covered with wanted posters and community outreach flyers, past the interview rooms where Madison had questioned hundreds of suspects, witnesses, and persons of interest in connection with the Brennan murders. Each conversation had been a thread she had hoped would unravel the larger tapestry of that terrible night. But until yesterday, every thread had led to dead ends. Captain Rodriguez's office occupied a corner of the building, with windows facing east toward the desert mountains that formed the backdrop of Madison's daily existence. Rodriguez had been a sergeant when Madison first joined the force, and he had watched her transformation from idealistic rookie to seasoned investigator to something harder to categorize, a woman who had made solving unsolved murders into both profession and purpose. "Sit down, both of you," Rodriguez said, gesturing toward chairs arranged in front of his desk. The office walls displayed commendations and photographs from Rodriguez's career, including several images from crime scenes that Madison recognized. The Brennan house was there, a photo from the initial investigation showing the front yard where neighbors had gathered to watch as bodies were wheeled out under white sheets. "I got a call from the district attorney's office an hour ago," Rodriguez began, his tone suggesting complications. "Marcus Webb's attorney is claiming that his DNA was obtained illegally during his 2019 arrest. Says the robbery charges were bogus, designed to get genetic material for cold cases." Madison felt her jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of legal maneuvering she had expected, the sort of procedural challenge that could derail 18 years of work in the matter of days. The 2019 arrest was legitimate. Armed robbery at a convenience store, 3 witnesses, security camera footage, the whole thing. "I know that and you know that, but Webb's lawyer is arguing that the DNA collection violated his Fourth Amendment rights because the robbery case was eventually plea bargained down to a misdemeanor." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking with the weight of his frustration. "It's a long shot, but if a judge buys it, we could lose the evidence that ties Webb to the Brennan murders." Ray Morrison shifted in his seat, his youth and inexperience suddenly visible in the way he fidgeted with his coffee cup. "What do we do? Can't we argue that the DNA match provides probable cause for additional investigation?" Madison had been through this dance before, had seen cases collapse because of technicalities that seemed designed to protect criminals at the expense of victims. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the clarity of the DNA match, or maybe it was simply that 18 years of frustration had hardened into a kind of determination that couldn't be shaken by legal posturing. "We build a case that doesn't rely solely on the DNA," Madison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades thinking about this exact scenario. "We go back to the beginning. We re-interview every witness, re-examine every piece of evidence, construct the timeline that puts Webb at the scene through traditional investigative work." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's going to require resources, overtime, laboratory fees, travel expenses if we need to track down witnesses who've moved out of state." "Then we get the resources," Madison replied. The conviction in her voice surprised even her. A reminder that somewhere beneath the fatigue and obsession, the woman who had first walked into the Brennan house in 2006 was still alive, still fighting. Jennifer Brennan fought her killer hard enough to get his DNA under her fingernails. She gave us everything we need to convict him. We're not going to let some defense attorney's procedural games dishonor her sacrifice. The room fell silent, the weight of 18 years settling over them like dust in desert air. Madison could feel the familiar sensation of a case beginning to accelerate, the momentum that built when investigation shifted from hope to certainty. Marcus Webb had been identified. Now came the harder task of ensuring that identification led to conviction. "All right," Rodriguez said finally. "You have my support. Whatever you need, within reason. But Madison..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know this case has been your life for 18 years. Don't let that dedication blind you to the possibility that Webb might walk on a technicality. Sometimes the system fails even when we do everything right." Madison stood, feeling the familiar weight of her service weapon against her hip, the badge clipped to her belt, all the tools of a profession that had consumed her adult life. "The system has already failed, Captain. It failed in 2006 when we couldn't identify the killer. It failed every year after that when families had to mark anniversaries without answers. Yesterday, science gave us a second chance. I'm not going to waste it." She walked toward the door, Ray Morrison following, leaving Captain Rodriguez alone with his coffee and his concern for a detective who had spent 18 years refusing to accept that some cases don't get solved, some monsters don't get caught, some families don't get justice. But Madison Clark had never been particularly good at accepting limitations, and she was about to prove that 18 years of obsession could be transformed into something powerful enough to put a killer behind bars forever. The Tucson Correctional Facility sat like a concrete tumor in the desert landscape, surrounded by razor wire that glinted in the morning sun like malicious jewelry. Madison Clark had made this drive dozens of times over the years, interviewing inmates who might have information about cold cases. But today felt different. Today, she was going to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed the Brennan family, and she was going to watch him realize that his 18 years of freedom were coming to an end. Marcus Webb was brought into the interview room in shackles, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that had grown gaunt during his 5 years of incarceration. He moved with a calculated indifference of someone who had spent decades navigating the criminal justice system, someone who understood that showing emotion was a luxury that could be used against him. But when he saw Madison waiting at the metal table, something flickered across his features. Recognition, maybe? Or perhaps just the instinctive wariness of a predator sensing another predator. "Mr. Webb," Madison said, her voice level and professional. Ray Morrison sat beside her, a digital recorder between them capturing every word that would be spoken in the next hour. "Mr. Webb, I'm Detective Madison Clark, Phoenix Police Department. This is Detective Morrison. We'd like to ask you some questions about your whereabouts in July 2006. Webb leaned back in his chair as much as the shackles would allow, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was 47, but looked older, his face weathered by decades of substance abuse and violence. His hands, Madison noted, were large and powerful, the hands that ended 4 lives on a summer night 18 years ago. July 2006, Webb repeated, as if trying to recall what he'd had for breakfast rather than discussing the time frame for a quadruple homicide. That's a long time ago, Detective. My memory ain't what it used to be. Let me help refresh it, Madison said, placing a photograph on the table between them. Jennifer Brennan's school portrait, the same image that had been reprinted in newspapers and broadcast on television screens across Arizona. Do you recognize this woman? Webb glanced at the photograph with the casual interest someone might show a menu at a restaurant they'd decided not to visit. Can't say I do. Pretty lady, though. Shame about whatever happened to her. Madison felt Ray tense beside her, recognizing the performance Webb was putting on. This was a man who had been through interrogations before, who knew the rhythms and expectations of police interviews. But Madison had been doing this for 18 years, and she had learned to read the micro-expressions that most people couldn't control. Her name was Jennifer Brennan, placing additional photographs on the table. This is her husband David, her daughter Sophia, her son Tommy. They lived at 2748 Sagaro Lane in Phoenix. All 4 were murdered on July 15, 2006. Now Webb's composure cracked slightly. Not much, just a momentary tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing pattern. Madison had seen this reaction before, the involuntary physical response that occurred when someone was confronted with evidence of their own crimes. Terrible thing, Webb said, his voice carrying just a hint of strain. But I don't know why you're showing me these pictures. I was probably in another state back then. I moved around a lot in those days. Madison opened a manila folder and withdrew a series of documents. Actually, according to these records, you were very much in Arizona in July 2006. You were arrested for public intoxication in Tempe on July 8th, just 1 week before the murders. Released on your own recognizance. The address you gave was 1247 Desert View Drive, which is exactly 3.2 miles from the Brennan house. The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the prison beyond the interview room walls. Webb's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who had introduced himself as Dennis Carver, leaned forward to whisper something in his client's ear. Madison watched the exchange with interest, noting how Webb's jaw tightened as he received whatever legal advice Carver was offering. My client has nothing further to say about this matter, Carver announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had built a career on protecting guilty people from the consequences of their actions. Any DNA evidence you think you have was obtained illegally, and my client's constitutional rights have been violated. Madison had expected this response, had prepared for the legal posturing that would inevitably accompany Webb's arrest. But she also knew that constitutional challenges took time to work their way through the courts, and she intended to use that time to build a case so airtight that no technicality could destroy it. Mr. Webb, Madison said, ignoring the lawyer and speaking directly to the man who had haunted her dreams for 18 years. Jennifer Brennan fought back when you attacked her family. She clawed at you, got your DNA under her fingernails. She marked you, Mr. Webb. Even in death, she marked you, so we would know who you were. For the first time since entering the room, Marcus Webb looked directly at Madison Clark, and she saw something in his eyes that confirmed what she had known since receiving the DNA results. This was her killer. This was the man who had turned the Brennan house into a charnel house, who had destroyed 4 innocent lives for reasons that might never be fully understood. Interview terminated, Carver said, standing and placing a hand on his client's shoulder. "Detective Clark, any further attempts to question my client will be considered harassment." As Webb was led from the room, his shackles clanking against the concrete floor, Madison felt a familiar mixture of frustration and determination. The legal battle was just beginning, but something fundamental had shifted. She had looked into the eyes of her monster, and he had blinked first. The drive back to Phoenix gave Madison time to process what had occurred in that sterile interview room. Webb's reaction to the photographs, his unconscious physical responses, the way he had avoided looking directly at the images of his victims, all of it confirmed what the DNA evidence had already established. But confirmation was different than conviction, and Madison knew that the next phase of the investigation would require reconstructing 18 years of evidence with the precision of an archaeologist. Dr. Ray Morrison had remained largely silent during the interview, but as they crossed the county line back into Phoenix, he finally spoke. "He did it. I could see it in his face when you showed him Jennifer's picture." "Seeing it and proving it are two different things," Madison replied, though she felt the same certainty that Ray had expressed. "Webb's been through the system enough times to know how to play the game. We need to be smarter than he is, more thorough than his lawyer expects us to be." The Phoenix Police Department had assigned Madison a conference room to serve as a command center for the Webb investigation, a space that quickly transformed into a mirror image of her apartment. Walls covered with photographs, timelines, evidence logs, and maps showing the geographical relationship between Webb's known addresses and the locations of unsolved crimes dating back to 2003. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived that afternoon with boxes containing every piece of physical evidence from the Brennan crime scene, materials that had been preserved with the hope that advancing technology might eventually unlock their secrets. Madison handled each item with the reverence of someone touching religious artifacts, knowing that these objects represented the final moments of a family's life. "We've retested everything we can," Sarah explained, pointing to evidence bags containing fiber samples, fingerprint cards, and trace materials that had been collected from the Brennan house. "The DNA under Jennifer's fingernails is definitely Webb's. 16 markers, perfect match. But we also found something interesting when we re-examined the clothes that were submitted as evidence." Sarah opened a bag containing David Brennan's work shirt, the blue cotton garment that he had been wearing when he was killed. Under magnification, she pointed to a small stain that had been noted in the original investigation, but never fully analyzed.
"This is blood that doesn't match any of the family members," Sarah said. "We tested it against Webb's profile. It's his blood, Madison. Somehow, David Brennan managed to injure his attacker during the struggle." Madison felt a surge of something that might have been pride, or grief, or both. The Brennan family had not died passively. They had fought back, both Jennifer and David marking their killer in ways that would eventually lead to his identification. In their final moments, they had been gathering evidence, creating the trail that would bring them justice 18 years later. "There's more," Sarah continued, opening additional evidence bags. "We found fibers on Sophia's pajamas that don't match anything in the house. They're from a work shirt, probably denim or heavy cotton. We can test them against clothes in Webb's possession to see if we get a match." The afternoon dissolved into a methodical examination of evidence that Madison had studied hundreds of times, but was now seeing with fresh eyes, with the context that Marcus Webb's identification provided. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every trace of biological material had the potential to strengthen the case against a man who had lived free for 18 years while 4 graves grew older in Desert Rest Cemetery. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the conference room as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the blinds that covered the room's single window. "How are we looking?" he asked, surveying the evidence spread across multiple tables like the components of a complex machine that Madison was learning to operate. "Better than I expected. The DNA evidence is solid, even if Webb's lawyer manages to challenge it, but we've got additional biological evidence, fiber matches, and a timeline that puts Webb in the immediate vicinity of the crime." "What about motive?" The original investigation never established why someone would target the Brennan family specifically. Madison had been thinking about this question since receiving the DNA results. Random home invasion seemed most likely, but the level of violence suggested something more personal, more deliberate. I think we're looking at someone who escalated from burglary to murder. The Brennan house was isolated, appeared wealthy from the outside, seemed like an easy target. But when the family woke up, when they tried to resist, Webb lost control. Ray Morrison, who had been quietly organizing crime scene photographs, looked up from his work. "I've been studying the pattern of injuries. This wasn't random violence. Webb took his time with each victim. There was something ritualistic about it, like he was enjoying the process." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, forcing everyone in the room to confront the reality of what had occurred in the Brennan house that July night. Madison had seen enough crime scenes to recognize the difference between killing for practical reasons and killing for pleasure, and the evidence suggested that Marcus Webb fell into the latter category. "We need to look at other cases from the same time period," Madison said, the implications of Ray's observation crystallizing into a plan of action. If Webb was killing for psychological gratification rather than financial gain, the Brennans might not have been his first victims. Sarah Chen nodded, already reaching for her phone to contact colleagues in other jurisdictions. "I'll run his DNA profile against cold case databases in California, Nevada, and New Mexico. If Webb was active in multiple states, we might find additional matches." As the evening progressed and additional members of the investigative team arrived to assist with the case reconstruction, Madison felt herself settling into a familiar rhythm. This was the work she had been born to do: methodical, patient, relentless pursuit of truth in service of victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The Brennan family had been waiting 18 years for this moment, and Madison was determined to ensure that their wait ended with justice rather than another legal technicality. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Detective Clark, this is Susan Brennan, Jennifer's mother. I heard on the news that you arrested someone for my daughter's murder. I wanted to thank you for never giving up. Jennifer would be proud of you." Madison stepped outside into the desert evening, where the temperature had dropped enough to make the air breathable. Susan Brennan had attended every memorial service, every anniversary press conference, every meeting with victims' advocates for the past 18 years. She was 78 years old now, a woman who had lived long enough to see her daughter's killer identified, but might not live long enough to see him convicted. The weight of that responsibility settled on Madison's shoulders like a familiar burden. This case had cost her a marriage, countless nights of sleep, and perhaps years of her life that she would never recover. But looking up at the desert sky, where stars were beginning to emerge from the darkness, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in years: certainty that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Marcus Webb was going to pay for what he had done to the Brennan family. Madison was going to make sure of it, even if it took another 18 years. The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday in April, 6 weeks after Marcus Webb's initial interview. Madison Clark was hunched over her computer in the conference room that had become her second office, cross-referencing Webb's known addresses with unsolved homicides across the southwestern United States, when her phone rang with the urgency that only came from discoveries that could change everything. "Madison, it's Detective Angela Vasquez from Albuquerque PD. I think we have a problem, or maybe a solution. I'm not sure which yet." The voice on the other end of the line carried the exhausted excitement of someone who had been working through the night on a case that refused to let them sleep. "What have you got, Angela? Remember that DNA sample you had us run through our cold case database? We got a hit. The Morales family murders from September 2005. Francisco and Maria Morales, their teenage daughter Carmen, and Maria's elderly mother. Home invasion. Same MO as your Brennan case. And Madison, there's something else. We found a witness." Madison felt her pulse quicken in the way that had become familiar over the past month and a half. The physical response to information that could either vindicate 18 years of obsession or expose the flaws in a case she had built with the dedication of a medieval cathedral architect. What kind of witness?
Neighbor kid, Miguel Santos. He was 14 in 2005, living across the street from the Morales family. Said he saw a white pickup truck parked outside their house the night of the murders. Gave us a partial license plate that we never had enough manpower to fully investigate. Madison was already reaching for her jacket, her body moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had received similar calls countless times over the past 18 years. The difference now was that she had a name to attach to the investigation, a face to put on the shadow that had haunted multiple crime scenes across multiple states. "I'm driving down tonight," Madison said, calculating the distance from Phoenix to Albuquerque in her head. 4.5 hours if she pushed the speed limit, which she intended to do. "Can you have Miguel Santos available for an interview in the morning?" "Already arranged." "Madison, if this is the same guy who killed your family in Phoenix, we might be looking at a serial killer who's been active for at least 2 decades. How many other families are out there that we don't know about?" The question followed Madison during the drive south through desert landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet under the pale light of a 3/4 moon. How many other families did Marcus Webb destroy while the system failed to connect the dots between jurisdictions, between states, between crimes that shared identical patterns but occurred months or years apart? Miguel Santos was 33 now, a construction supervisor with calloused hands and eyes that still held the shadows of what he had witnessed as a teenager. He sat across from Madison and Detective Vasquez in an interview room that could have been the twin of the one where Webb had been questioned 6 weeks earlier. Same fluorescent lights, same metal table, same sense that truth was something that had to be excavated from layers of time and memory. "I never forgot that truck," Miguel said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 2 decades of carrying someone else's secrets. "White Chevy pickup, maybe early 2000s model. Had one of those toolboxes in the back, the kind construction guys use." Madison felt something electric course through her nervous system. Webb's arrest record from 2006 showed that he had been working construction jobs throughout Arizona and New Mexico, the kind of transient employment that would have given him access to work trucks and provided cover for traveling between crime scenes. "Tell me about the license plate," Detective Vasquez prompted, sliding a legal pad across the table toward Miguel. "You said you remembered part of it." Miguel picked up the pen with hands that trembled slightly, the physical manifestation of memories that had been buried but never forgotten. "I remember it started with JKF, because those were my grandfather's initials, Jose Kevin Franco. The rest was numbers, but I only caught a couple of them, maybe a 7 and a 3, but I couldn't swear it in court." Madison exchanged glances with Detective Vasquez, both women recognizing the significance of what they were hearing. A partial license plate from 2005, combined with DNA evidence from 2024, created a timeline that could place Marcus Webb at multiple crime scenes across multiple states. The web of evidence was becoming dense enough to trap even the most cunning predator.
"Miguel, I need you to think carefully about this next question," Madison said, leaning forward with the intensity that had defined her approach to every interview over the past 18 years. "Did you see the driver of the truck? Even a glimpse, even just a silhouette?" Miguel closed his eyes, his face scrunched with the effort of reaching back through time to retrieve details that his 14-year-old brain had recorded, but his adult mind had tried to forget. Big guy, taller than average anyway, wearing what looked like work clothes, maybe jeans and a t-shirt, but it was dark and I was scared. The Morales family had been good to us, Carmen used to help me with homework sometimes. The interview continued for another hour, with Miguel providing details about the timeline of that September night, the sounds he had heard from across the street, the police cars and ambulances that had transformed his quiet neighborhood into a crime scene that made the local news for weeks. By the time they finished, Madison had filled 17 pages of her notebook with information that would need to be cross-referenced with evidence from New Mexico, Arizona, and potentially other states where Marcus Webb might have left his signature of violence. Detective Vasquez walked Madison to her car as the sun was setting over Albuquerque, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded both women why they had chosen to build their lives in the American Southwest. "This is big, Madison. If we can tie Webb to the Morales murders, and if there are other cases out there, we're talking about one of the most prolific serial killers in regional history. The question is whether we can prove it before his lawyer finds a way to get the DNA evidence thrown out," Madison replied, though she felt more confident than she had in weeks. The case against Marcus Webb was becoming something larger than any single jurisdiction could have built alone, a collaboration between police departments that had been unknowingly hunting the same predator for decades. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The drive back to Phoenix gave Madison time to process the implications of what she had learned in Albuquerque. If Webb had been killing families since at least 2005, and if his pattern was consistent, there might be additional victims in states that had never been contacted by Arizona investigators. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond anything she had imagined when the DNA results first came back. She arrived at the Phoenix Police Department at 11:30 p.m. to find Detective Ray Morrison still working in the conference room, surrounded by printouts and case files that he had organized with the obsessive attention to detail that Madison recognized in herself. Ray looked up as she entered, his young face showing the strain of weeks spent immersed in the kind of violence that aged cops before their time. "How'd it go in Albuquerque?" Ray asked, though Madison's expression had already provided much of the answer. "We've got him for a second family," Madison said, dropping into a chair and feeling the exhaustion of an 18-hour day settle into her bones. "Same MO, same level of violence, DNA match confirmed. But Ray, I think we're just scratching the surface here." She spent the next hour briefing Ray on Miguel Santos's testimony, the partial license plate, the timeline that placed Webb in New Mexico 1 month before the Brennan murders. As she spoke, she could see Ray's understanding of the case shifting from a single quadruple homicide to something much larger and more terrifying. "We need to expand the search," Ray said, voicing the conclusion that Madison had reached during the drive home. If Webb was active in Arizona and New Mexico, he might have been killing in California, Nevada, Utah, anywhere he could find isolated families, anywhere he could disappear into the construction industry between jobs. Madison nodded, already mentally composing the emails she would send to police departments across the region, the requests for case files and DNA comparisons that either vindicate her growing suspicions or reveal that Marcus Webb was simply a more limited monster than the evidence suggested. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Sarah Chen. "Madison, we got the fiber results back from Sophia Brennan's pajamas. Perfect match to a work shirt found in Webb's cell during a contraband search last month. Call me when you get this." Madison felt a smile spread across her face for the first time in weeks, the kind of expression that had become foreign to her after 18 years of disappointment and dead ends. The physical evidence was aligning with the witness testimony, the DNA results were being corroborated by traditional detective work, and Marcus Webb's carefully constructed defense was beginning to crumble under the weight of scientific precision. "We've got him," she said to Ray, holding up her phone to show him Sarah's text message. "Fiber match, DNA match, witness testimony from multiple states. Webb's lawyer can challenge individual pieces of evidence, but he can't challenge all of it."
Ray Morrison grinned with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing his first major case breakthrough, the moment when months of methodical work suddenly crystallized into something that could change lives. "So what's our next move?" Madison looked around the conference room that had become a shrine to the Brennan family and the other victims whose names were now appearing on whiteboards and evidence boards throughout the space. Jennifer Brennan's school photograph still occupied the central position, but she was no longer alone. The Morales family photos had been added, and Madison suspected that more faces would join them as the investigation expanded. "Our next move is to make sure that Marcus Webb never sees the outside of a prison cell again," Madison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 18 years learning how to transform obsession into justice. "And our next move is to find every family he destroyed, so that every victim gets the justice they deserve."
She pulled out her phone and began dialing the number for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. If Marcus Webb was the serial killer that the evidence suggested, the case had grown beyond what any single police department could handle alone. It was time to bring in resources that matched the scope of the crimes they were investigating. As she waited for the call to connect, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced since July 2006, the certainty that she was going to win. Marcus Webb had spent 18 years believing that he had committed the perfect crimes, that the families he had destroyed would never get justice. He was about to learn that some debts take decades to collect, but they always come due eventually. The phone rang once, twice, and then a professional voice answered. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, this is Special Agent Patricia Monroe. Agent Monroe, this is Detective Madison Clark, Phoenix Police Department. I need to report a serial killer. The federal courthouse in Phoenix rose from the desert landscape like a monument to the possibility of justice, its glass and steel structure reflecting the morning sun with an intensity that forced Madison Clark to shield her eyes as she walked toward the entrance. October 15, 2024, exactly 15 months since the DNA match that had changed everything, and the first day of Marcus Webb's trial for the murders of Jennifer, David, Sophia, and Tommy Brennan. Madison wore her best suit, navy blue with silver buttons that had been her armor for every major court appearance over the past 18 years. Her badge was polished to mirror brightness, her weapons secured, her notebook filled with 18 years of observations, theories, and facts that had finally coalesced into a case that even the most skeptical defense attorney would struggle to dismantle. The media attention had been building for months, ever since the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had confirmed that Marcus Webb was connected to at least 7 family annihilations across 4 states between 2003 and 2007. True crime podcasts had dissected every aspect of the case. Television documentaries had interviewed everyone from Webb's elementary school teachers to the detectives who had worked the original investigations. And social media had transformed the Brennan family into symbols of victims whose patience for justice had finally been rewarded. Special Agent Patricia Monroe stood at the courthouse entrance, her FBI credentials gleaming against the dark fabric of her suit. At 45, Monroe was the kind of federal agent who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Someone who had built her career on understanding the psychological patterns that drove serial killers to destroy innocent families. "Ready for this, Detective Clark?" she asked, extending her hand in greeting. Over the past year, Monroe had become more than a federal colleague. She had become a partner in the kind of investigation that transforms law enforcement careers into crusades for justice. "I've been ready for 18 years. Though Madison realized that readiness was more complex than simple determination. This trial represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of work, but it also represented the possibility of failure, of watching Marcus Webb walk free on technicalities while families across multiple states continued to grieve without closure. They entered the courthouse together, passing through security checkpoints that had become routine, but never comfortable. Madison's service weapon was secured in the gun lockers provided for law enforcement personnel, a temporary surrender of the tools that had defined her professional identity. In the courtroom, she would be armed only with evidence, testimony, and the hope that 18 years of obsessive preparation would be enough to convict a man who had destroyed at least 28 lives across multiple states. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in an adjacent room where victims' families could watch the proceedings via closed-circuit television. Susan Brennan, now 79, and moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age, occupied a seat in the front row, her presence a reminder of how much time had passed since her daughter's murder and how little time might remain for her to see justice delivered. Madison had visited Susan Brennan 3 times in the past month, preparing her for testimony that would require her to relive the worst day of her life while cameras recorded every emotion for public consumption. At 79, Susan retained the fierce intelligence that had made her a successful high school principal for 30 years. But grief had carved lines in her face that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions that had persisted for nearly 2 decades. "Mrs. Brennan," Madison had said during their last meeting, "I need you to know that we have enough evidence to convict Marcus Webb, even without your testimony. You don't have to put yourself through this if it's too difficult." Susan Brennan had looked at Madison with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. "Detective, I've been waiting 18 years to look at the man who killed my daughter and tell a jury what kind of person Jennifer was. Wild horses couldn't keep me from that witness stand." Now, watching Susan take her seat in the courtroom, Madison felt the weight of representing not just the Brennan family, but all the families whose lives had been destroyed by a predator who had operated across state lines for years while law enforcement agencies failed to recognize the pattern of his crimes. Marcus Webb entered the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit replaced by a gray suit that his attorney had selected to make him appear less threatening to potential jurors. At 48, Webb looked older than his chronological age, his face weathered by years of incarceration and the stress of knowing that multiple police departments had spent months building cases that could result in multiple death sentences. His attorney, Dennis Carver, had gained national attention for his aggressive defense of serial killers, a legal specialist who commanded fees that suggested Webb had access to financial resources that remained unexplained. Carver was tall, expensively dressed, and possessed the kind of courtroom charisma that could convince juries to ignore evidence in favor of reasonable doubt manufactured through procedural challenges and character assassination. Judge Margaret Hernandez called the court to order with the authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but recognized that this trial would define the final years of her judicial career. At 62, Judge Hernandez had earned a reputation for fairness, balanced with intolerance for legal games that prioritized technicalities over truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Hernandez began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "you are about to hear evidence in the case of the state of Arizona versus Marcus Webb, who stands accused of 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jennifer Brennan, David Brennan, Sophia Brennan, and Tommy Brennan, which occurred on July 15, 2006. The prosecutor, District Attorney Maria Santos, was a woman Madison had worked on dozens of cases over the past decade. Santos had built her career on complex homicide prosecutions, but the Webb case represented something unprecedented in her experience. A serial killer whose crimes had remained unsolved long enough to become cold cases before advances in DNA technology had made identification possible. Your Honor, members of the jury, you are about to hear evidence in the case of the state of Arizona versus Marcus Webb, who stands accused of 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jennifer Brennan, David Brennan, Sophia Brennan, and Tommy Brennan, which occurred on July 15, 2006. Santos moved through the courtroom with practiced ease, positioning herself where every juror could see her face as she outlined the evidence that would be presented over the coming weeks. DNA evidence, fiber matches, witness testimony from multiple states, and a pattern of violence that had terrorized families across the American Southwest for at least 4 years. The evidence will show that Marcus Webb is responsible not only for the murders of the Brennan family, but for similar crimes in New Mexico, California, and Nevada. The evidence will show that the defendant targeted families with children, that he took pleasure in their terror, and that he has shown no remorse for crimes that have destroyed dozens of lives. Madison watched the faces of the 12 jurors as Santos spoke, reading their expressions for signs of how they might respond to the evidence that would be presented. The jury was evenly split between men and women, ranging in age from 28 to 67, representing the kind of demographic cross-section that could deliver justice or allow a serial killer to escape conviction through legal technicalities. Defense attorney Dennis Carver's opening statement focused entirely on procedural challenges, arguing that his client's constitutional rights had been violated when DNA samples were collected during his 2019 arrest for armed robbery. Carver was smooth,
persuasive, and completely unconcerned with his client's actual guilt or innocence.
Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about whether a terrible crime was committed, Carver said, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone who had made a career out of protecting criminals from consequences. These murders were indeed terrible, and the families deserve justice. But this case is about whether the government can violate an American citizen's constitutional rights and then use illegally obtained evidence to secure a conviction. Madison felt her jaw tighten as Carver continued his attack on the investigation that had consumed 18 years of her life. This was the legal strategy she had expected, the attempt to win acquittal through procedural challenges rather than addressing the mountain of evidence that connected Marcus Webb to multiple family annihilations. The first week of testimony focused on the original crime scene investigation, with Madison taking the witness stand to describe her arrival at the Brennan house on July 16, 2006. She had prepared for this moment through countless hours of practice, but actually sitting in the witness box, looking out at a courtroom filled with reporters and family members, felt surreal in a way that 18 years of anticipation hadn't fully prepared her for. Detective Clark, District Attorney Santos said, "Please tell the jury what you observed when you first entered the Brennan house on the morning of July 16, 2006. Madison took a breath, centering herself in the same way she had done thousands of times when facing difficult crime scenes. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual for the neighborhood. Inside, I found clear signs of a struggle in the living room, furniture overturned, blood spatter on the walls, broken glass from a lamp that had been knocked over during the altercation." She continued for 3 hours, walking the jury through every detail of the crime scene, every piece of evidence that had been collected, every decision that had been made during the initial investigation. Madison was careful to acknowledge the limitations of 2006 technology while explaining how recent advances had made Marcus Webb's identification possible. Detective Clark, District Attorney Santos said, "Isn't it true that you've been personally invested in this case to a degree that might be considered unusual, even unhealthy?" Madison felt heat rise in her chest, the familiar anger that came from having her professionalism questioned by someone whose only concern was protecting guilty clients from consequences. "Mr. Carver, I've been dedicated to finding justice for the Brennan family, just as I've been dedicated to every case I've worked over the past 20 years. If you consider seeking justice for murder victims to be unhealthy, then I suppose we have different definitions of what police officers should prioritize." The exchange continued for another hour, with Carver attempting to portray Madison as an obsessed detective who had manufactured evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. But Madison had anticipated every line of attack, had prepared responses that demonstrated the methodical, scientific approach that eventually led to Webb's identification. Dr. Sarah Chen's testimony occupied the second week of the trial, with Sarah, the forensic DNA analyst, explaining in detail how genetic evidence from the crime scene had been matched to samples in the CODIS database. Sarah's presentation was technical but accessible, walking the jury through the scientific processes that had made Marcus Webb's identification possible after 18 years. Dr. Chen, District Attorney Santos asked, "What is the statistical probability that the DNA found under Jennifer Brennan's fingernails belongs to someone other than Marcus Webb?" "The probability is approximately 1 in 47 billion. To put that in perspective, there are fewer than 8 billion people currently alive on Earth. The DNA evidence conclusively identifies Marcus Webb as Jennifer Brennan's killer." Dennis Carver's cross-examination of Sarah focused on the chain of custody for the DNA evidence, suggesting that samples might have been contaminated or mislabeled during the 18 years they had been stored. But Sarah was prepared for these challenges, producing documentation that tracked every movement of the evidence from the initial collection through the final analysis. Miguel Santos, the witness from Albuquerque who had seen Webb's truck outside the Morales house in 2005, testified during the third week of the trial.
Now 34 years old, Miguel had built a successful construction business, but he retained clear memories of the night that had changed his understanding of how quickly ordinary neighborhoods could become crime scenes. I was doing homework by my bedroom window when I saw the white pickup truck park across the street. It was unusual because the Morales family didn't usually have visitors that late at night.
Miguel's testimony was corroborated by evidence from the Albuquerque crime scene, fiber matches that connected Webb to multiple murders, and a timeline that demonstrated his presence in New Mexico just weeks before the Brennan murders. The cumulative effect was a case that transcended any single jurisdiction, revealing a pattern of violence that had terrorized families across multiple states. Susan Brennan testified on the final day of the prosecution's case, her voice never wavering as she described her daughter's life, her love for her family, her dedication to the children she taught. Susan had dressed carefully for this moment, wearing a blue dress that Jennifer had given her for Mother's Day 2005, carrying photographs that showed the Brennan family during happier times. Jennifer was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special, Susan testified, her eyes fixed on the jury rather than on Marcus Webb, who sat 30 feet away. She remembered her students' birthdays. She volunteered at the animal shelter. She called me every Sunday to make sure I was taking care of myself. The world became a darker place when she died, but it will become brighter when her killer is finally held accountable. The defense case lasted 3 days, with Dennis Carver calling witnesses who testified about Marcus Webb's troubled childhood, his history of substance abuse, his claims of mental illness that might mitigate his responsibility for the crimes. But Carver was fighting against 18 years of accumulated evidence, scientific proof that placed his client at multiple crime scenes, and testimony from witnesses who had waited decades to tell their stories. During closing arguments, District Attorney Maria Santos stood before the jury with photographs of all 4 Brennan family members arranged on easels behind her. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about justice delayed but not denied. For 18 years, Marcus Webb believed that he had committed the perfect crimes. For 18 years, the families of his victims lived without answers, without closure, without the knowledge that their loved one's killer would be held accountable. Santos paused, allowing her words to settle in the packed courtroom. But justice has no expiration date. Science has no statute of limitations, and the dead do not forget those who murdered them. Jennifer Brennan fought back against her killer, marking him with her fingernails so that we would know, 18 years later, who had destroyed her family. She gave us the evidence we needed to convict Marcus Webb, and we owe it to her memory to use that evidence wisely. Dennis Carver's closing argument lasted 90 minutes, a final attempt to convince the jury that constitutional rights were more important than scientific evidence, that procedural protections should override DNA matches that identified his client as a serial killer. But Madison could read the jury's faces, could see that 18 years of methodical investigation had created a case that no legal maneuvering could dismantle. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with verdicts that would echo through courtrooms across multiple states. Guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges related to the Morales family murders in New Mexico and other crimes that had been connected to Marcus Webb through the expanded investigation. Madison felt tears on her cheeks for the first time in years, the physical release of 18 years of pressure that had finally found resolution. Susan Brennan was crying openly, her hands pressed to her heart as she absorbed the reality that her daughter's killer would never walk free again. Judge Margaret Hernandez scheduled the sentencing hearing for November 15, 2024, exactly 1 month after the verdict. As Marcus Webb was led from the courtroom in shackles, he turned to look at Madison Clark one final time. Their eyes met across the courtroom, predator and pursuer, killer and the detective who had refused to let his crimes remain unsolved.
Madison stared back without flinching, her gaze carrying 18 years of determination and the satisfaction of promises kept to victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Marcus Webb looked away first, just as he had during their initial interview 18 months earlier. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The Brennan family could finally rest in peace, knowing that their killer would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, that their deaths had not been forgotten, that someone had cared enough to spend 18 years seeking the truth.
As Madison walked from the courthouse into the desert afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in decades, as if a weight she had carried for so long that she had forgotten its presence had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The case that had defined her adult life was over, but the work of protecting innocent families from predators would continue. There would always be another case, another family destroyed by violence, another mystery that needed solving. But tonight, Madison Clark was going to go home, pour herself a glass of wine, and remember what it felt like to win. 3 years later, November 2027. Detective Madison Clark stood before the graduating class of the Phoenix Police Academy, her graying hair pulled back in the same practical style she had worn for the past 25 years. But something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders for 18 years had been replaced by something different. Not lighter exactly, but more purposeful, as if the resolution of the Brennan case had transformed obsession into wisdom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Madison began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium filled with fresh-faced recruits who looked impossibly young to her 53-year-old eyes. "I want to tell you about a case that taught me everything I know about the difference between giving up and letting go." The story of Marcus Webb had become legendary within law enforcement circles, a case study taught in police academies across the country about the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining hope, and understanding that some investigations require decades rather than months to reach resolution. But for Madison, speaking to new officers about the Brennan case had become something more personal, a way of ensuring that the lessons learned through 18 years of frustration would benefit future generations of investigators. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing Jennifer Brennan's school photograph alongside images of her children, husband, and the crime scene that had defined Madison's career. The rookies in the audience shifted slightly, recognizing that they were about to hear something that would change their understanding of what police work could demand from those who chose to pursue it as more than just a job. This is Jennifer Brennan, kindergarten teacher, mother of 2, victim of a quadruple homicide that remained unsolved for 18 years. When I first walked into the Brennan house in July 2006, I had no idea that this case would consume the next 2 decades of my life, cost me a marriage, and teach me more about persistence than I ever wanted to learn. The presentation continued for 90 minutes, walking the new officers through every phase of the investigation, from the initial crime scene through the DNA breakthrough that had finally identified Marcus Webb. She was careful to emphasize the technological advances that had made the solution possible, but she also stressed the importance of maintaining hope even when cases seemed impossible to solve. "The most important lesson from the Brennan case," Madison concluded, "is that justice has no expiration date. Evidence properly preserved can solve crimes decades after they occur. Witnesses who seem unimportant today might become crucial years from now, and families who deserve answers don't stop deserving them just because time passes." After the presentation, a young recruit approached Madison with the earnest intensity that reminded her of herself at that age. "Detective Clark, how do you keep working cases when you know they might never be solved? How do you maintain hope for families who might wait years for answers?" Madison studied the young woman's face,
recognizing the idealism that both drives and destroys police officers who believe that dedication alone can overcome the chaos of human violence. "Officer, what's your name?" "Patricia Morales, ma'am." Madison felt a chill of recognition. Morales was the name of the New Mexico family that Marcus Webb had killed in 2005, the case that had helped establish his pattern of crimes across multiple states. "Are you related to the Morales family from Albuquerque?" "Carmen Morales was my cousin," Patricia replied, her voice steady but carrying undertones of grief that Madison recognized in herself. "She was killed when I was 12 years old. The case was never solved until you connected it to Marcus Webb. I became a police officer because I wanted to help other families get the answers my family waited 18 years to receive." Madison felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from encountering the long-term effects of unsolved cases, the ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims to touch lives in ways that investigators often never discovered. Patricia Morales had chosen law enforcement as a career because her cousin's murder had remained unsolved for 18 years, because justice delayed had created a vacuum that needed to be filled by someone willing to stand between innocent families and the predators who targeted them. "Officer Morales, I want you to remember that the work we do matters even when we can't see the results immediately. Your cousin Carmen fought back against her killer, just like Jennifer Brennan did. They gave us the evidence we needed to eventually convict Marcus Webb, but it took 18 years for science to catch up with their courage." They talked for another 20 minutes, with Madison sharing insights about case management, evidence preservation, and the psychological tools necessary to work cold cases without losing hope or sanity. As Patricia Morales walked away to join her fellow recruits, Madison felt a profound sense of continuity, as if the work she had done on the Brennan case was extending into the future through young officers who understood that some investigations require patience measured in decades rather than months. 5 years later, March 2029. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, while Madison was reviewing case files in her office at the Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Unit, a specialized division that had been created in 2025 partly in response to the success of the Webb investigation. At 55, Madison had been promoted to sergeant and given responsibility for overseeing the unit's work on unsolved homicides dating back to the 1990s. "Sergeant Clark, this is Detective Lisa Patel from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. I'm calling about a DNA match we got from a case you worked several years ago." Madison felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied news about cases she had thought were permanently closed. "Which case, Detective Patel?" "Marcus Webb. We've got his DNA at a crime scene from 2003, 2 years before the earliest case you connected to him. The Morrison family, parents and 3 children, home invasion in Henderson. We always suspected it was connected to other cases, but we never had enough evidence to prove it." Madison leaned back in her chair, absorbing the implications of what she was hearing. Marcus Webb's known timeline was extending backward, potentially adding 5 more victims to a total that already included at least 28 people across 4 states. The Morrison family had been waiting 26 years for justice, even longer than the Brennans had waited. "How solid is the match?" Madison asked, though she already knew that Detective Patel wouldn't have called unless the evidence was conclusive. 16 markers, perfect match. But here's the thing, Sergeant Clark. We found something else at the Morrison scene that we never released to the public, a signature that might help us identify other cases." Madison felt the familiar stirring of an investigation beginning to accelerate, the momentum that built when new evidence opened previously unknown possibilities. "What kind of signature?" Webb left a playing card at the scene, the ace of spades, placed on the father's chest. We thought it might be significant, but without other cases to compare it to, we couldn't establish a pattern. The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. If Marcus Webb had been leaving playing cards at crime scenes, and if investigators had never connected this detail between jurisdictions, how many other families had been murdered by the same man while police departments across the country failed to recognize the pattern of his crimes? Detective Patel, I need you to contact every police department in Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Utah. Ask them to check their cold case files for home invasion murders where playing cards were found at the scene. Don't specify which card. Let them tell you what they found. The investigation that followed consumed 8 months and involved 12 police departments across 5 states. By November 2029, investigators had connected Marcus Webb to 43 murders spanning from 2003 to 2007, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The playing card signature had been present at 11 different crime scenes, but had never been shared between jurisdictions because each police department had treated it as unique evidence that needed to be protected from public disclosure. Madison found herself at the center of a media storm that transformed the Webb case from a regional story into national news. True crime documentaries were produced, academic papers were written about the importance of interjurisdictional communication, and Congress held hearings about the need for better information sharing between police departments investigating similar crimes. But for Madison, the expansion of the Webb case represented something more personal than professional recognition. 11 additional families had been destroyed by a predator who might have been stopped earlier if law enforcement agencies had been better at recognizing patterns that crossed state lines. She attended memorial services for the Morrison family in Las Vegas, the Rodriguez family in Phoenix, the Chen's family in San Diego, and 8 other families whose names had been added to the growing list of Webb's victims. At each service, Madison met family members who had waited decades for answers, relatives who had never given up hope that their loved one's killer would eventually be identified. 10 years later, July 2034. The Arizona State University campus in Phoenix buzzed with the energy of summer session students as Madison Clark walked toward the criminology building where she had been teaching for the past 3 years. At 60, she had retired from active police work, but had found a new purpose in educating the next generation of investigators, sharing lessons learned through nearly 27 years of hunting killers who thought they could remain invisible forever. Her course, Cold Case Investigation, Theory and Practice, had become one of the most popular electives in the university's criminal justice program, drawing students from across the country who wanted to learn from the detective who had spent 18 years solving one of Arizona's most notorious unsolved murders. Madison's office walls were covered with photographs and letters from families whose cases had been solved using techniques developed during the Webb investigation. The cold case unit she had helped establish had solved 47 previously unsolved homicides in the 9 years since its creation, giving closure to families who had waited decades for answers about their murdered relatives. A knock on her office door interrupted her preparation for the afternoon lecture. A young woman stood in the doorway, holding a manila folder with the nervous intensity Madison recognized in students who had personal rather than academic reasons for studying criminal justice. "Professor Clark, my name is Emma Brennan. I'm Jennifer Brennan's niece." Madison felt time compress around her. The present moment suddenly connected to that terrible morning in July 2006 when she had first walked into the Brennan house and encountered a crime scene that would define the rest of her career. Emma Brennan was 28 now, a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to her aunt in the way she carried herself, the intelligence in her eyes, the sense of purpose that radiated from her bearing. "Emma," Madison said, standing and extending her hand. "I've wondered about you over the years. Your grandmother Susan mentioned you often during the trial."
Emma stepped into the office, her eyes scanning the photographs and case materials that covered Madison's walls. "Grandma Susan passed away last year," she said quietly. She was 86. She lived long enough to see Marcus Webb sentenced to death, which meant everything to her. Madison felt a familiar pang of loss. Susan Brennan had become more than a victim's family member over the years. She had become a friend, someone who understood the weight of carrying unsolved cases and a relief that came when justice was finally delivered. They had spoken regularly after Webb's conviction, sharing updates about the expanded investigation and the additional families who had found closure through their work. "She was an extraordinary woman," Madison said. "I'm sorry for your loss. What brings you here today?" Emma opened the manila folder she had been carrying, revealing documents that Madison recognized as police reports, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be academic research papers. "I'm finishing my doctoral dissertation in criminology at Arizona State. My research focuses on the long-term psychological effects of unsolved murders on victims' families." Madison felt a chill of recognition. Emma Brennan had chosen to study the very phenomenon that had defined her own family's experience, the way that unsolved murders created wounds that couldn't heal until justice was delivered. "What did you discover?" "That families of unsolved murder victims experience a unique form of trauma that combines grief with uncertainty. The not knowing is almost as devastating as the loss itself. But I also discovered something else. When cases are eventually solved, families often report feeling a sense of completion that allows them to move forward in ways that weren't possible while the murders remained unsolved." Madison nodded, thinking of the dozens of families she had met over the years whose lives had been transformed by the resolution of cold cases. "Your research probably saved lives, Emma. Not in the obvious way, but by helping families understand that their feelings were normal, that their need for answers was legitimate." Emma smiled, the first genuine expression Madison had seen since she had entered the office. "Actually, Professor Clark, I wanted to talk to you about something else. I'm starting law school in the fall. I want to become a prosecutor specializing in cold cases. I want to help families like mine get justice, even when it takes decades." Madison felt a profound sense of continuity, as if the work she had done on the Brennan case was extending into the future through Emma's choice to dedicate her career to seeking justice for unsolved murders. Emma Brennan was choosing to transform her family's tragedy into a tool for helping other families, continuing the work that had begun with her aunt's fingernails marking a killer in her final moments. "Emma," Madison said, "I think your Aunt Jennifer would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become, and I think she would be proud that her death led to something that will help other families for years to come." They talked for 2 hours, with Madison sharing insights about the investigation that had defined her career, and Emma describing her plans for combining legal training with criminological research to improve the prosecution of cold cases. As Emma prepared to leave, she handed Madison a photograph that had been tucked inside her folder. The image showed the Brennan family during Christmas 2005, 7 months before the murders that had destroyed their lives. Jennifer and David sat on a couch with Sophia and Tommy on their laps, all four wearing matching red sweaters and smiling with the kind of unconscious joy that only comes from feeling completely safe in the world. "I wanted you to have this," Emma said. "For 18 years you carried the weight of my family's murder. I thought you should have a picture of them when they were happy, when they were alive, when they were everything they should have been remembered for." Madison felt tears in her eyes as she studied the photograph, seeing the Brennan family as they had lived rather than as they had died. For 18 years, her mental image of Jennifer, David, Sophia, and Tommy had been tied to the crime scene where their lives had ended. This photograph offered something different, a reminder that they had been more than victims, that they had been a family that loved each other, that their lives had meaning beyond the terrible way they had ended. 15 years later, July 2039, the Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Unit occupied an entire floor of the headquarters building, its expansion funded by federal grants and private donations from families whose cases had been solved using techniques pioneered during the Webb investigation. Detective Patricia Morales, now 38 and the unit's commanding officer, stood before a wall covered with photographs of solved cases, each image representing a family that had found closure after years or decades of waiting for answers. Madison Clark's retirement portrait occupied a place of honor in the center of the display, surrounded by letters from grateful families and commendations from law enforcement agencies across the country. At 75, Madison had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous winter, her death marking the end of an era in Phoenix law enforcement. The memorial service for Madison had filled the largest church in Phoenix, attended by hundreds of police officers, prosecutors, judges, and family members whose lives had been changed by her work. Emma Brennan-Martinez, now a federal prosecutor specializing in cold cases, had delivered the eulogy, describing Madison as the woman who had given her family the gift of closure and inspired her to dedicate her career to seeking justice for others. Detective Clark never forgot that every case file represents a family that deserves answers, Emma had said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. She taught us that justice has no expiration date, that evidence properly preserved can solve crimes decades after they occur, and that families who deserve closure don't stop deserving it just because time passes. Patricia Morales walked through the cold case unit, checking on investigations that continued the work Madison had begun. The unit now employed 12 detectives, 3 forensic analysts, and 2 victim advocates, all working on cases that other police departments had been forced to shelve due to lack of leads or resources. The Webb case had become a template for how complex serial investigations should be conducted, with procedures for interjurisdictional communication, evidence sharing, and victim family notification that were now standard practice across the country. Law enforcement agencies routinely shared information about crime scene signatures, DNA evidence, and behavioral patterns that might connect cases across state lines. Marcus Webb himself had died in prison in 2037, succumbing to lung cancer at the age of 60. His death had been noted in newspapers across the southwestern United States, but his passing had generated little public interest. The man who had terrorized families for years had died alone and forgotten, while his victims were remembered through memorials, scholarships, and the continued work of investigators who refused to let cold cases remain unsolved. Patricia opened a case file that had arrived that morning from the Spokane Police Department, a family annihilation from 2008 that shared characteristics with Webb's known crimes. Even 12 years after his death, new evidence occasionally surfaced that connected additional murders to his reign of terror, each discovery providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The DNA comparison would take several weeks, but Patricia felt confident that science would once again provide the evidence needed to give another family the closure they deserved. The work continued, inspired by Madison Clark's example and driven by the understanding that every unsolved murder represented a family whose pain could be transformed into peace through the patient application of investigative skill and advancing technology. 25 years later, July 2049. The true crime podcast, Cold Justice, reached its 100th episode with a special retrospective on the Marcus Webb case, examining how the investigation had changed law enforcement practices and inspired a generation of investigators to pursue careers in cold case work. The podcast was hosted by Dr. Emma Brennan-Martinez, now 53, and one of the country's leading experts on prosecuting cold cases involving serial killers. 25 years ago, Emma said into the microphone in her home studio, Detective Madison Clark received a phone call that would change everything. DNA evidence had finally identified the man who had murdered my Aunt Jennifer, my Uncle David, and my cousins Sophia and Tommy. What followed was an investigation that revealed Marcus Webb to be one of America's most prolific serial killers, responsible for at least 43 murders across 5 states.
The episode featured interviews with retired FBI agent Patricia Monroe, former Phoenix Police Captain Miguel Rodriguez, and Dr. Sarah Chen, whose DNA analysis had made Webb's identification possible. Each interview explored different aspects of the investigation, from the technological advances that had enabled the breakthrough to the psychological toll of working cases that remained unsolved for decades. The Brennan case taught us that families never stop hoping for justice, Dr. Chen said during her interview. The evidence we preserve today might not be analyzable with current technology, but advances in science happen every year. What seems impossible to solve today might be routine 20 years from now. The podcast had become a memorial to Madison Clark's work and an inspiration for current investigators working cold cases across the country. Emma had started the series 5 years earlier as a way of honoring her aunt's memory and sharing stories of families who had found closure through the persistent work of detectives who refused to give up on unsolved murders. Each episode focused on a cold case that had been solved using techniques developed during the Webb investigation, with interviews of family members, investigators, and the forensic specialists whose work had made resolution possible. The podcast had attracted millions of listeners worldwide, creating a community of people interested in supporting cold case investigations and advocating for families still waiting for answers about their murdered relatives. Emma's office in the federal courthouse displayed photographs from across the years since Webb's conviction, her law school graduation, her wedding to fellow prosecutor Miguel Martinez, the birth of their 2 children, and countless images from court proceedings where cold cases had been successfully prosecuted. But the centerpiece of the display remained the Christmas photograph that Madison Clark had treasured for the final 15 years of her life. The Brennan family, as they had lived, happy and whole, and unaware that their time together was measured in months rather than decades. 30 years later, July 2054. The Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Unit celebrated its 30th anniversary with a ceremony attended by law enforcement officials from across the country, all gathered to recognize the impact that Madison Clark's work had had on modern investigative practices. The unit had solved 847 previously unsolved homicides since its creation, providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers about their murdered relatives. Detective Madison Martinez, Emma Brennan-Martinez's 22-year-old daughter, stood before the assembled crowd as the ceremony's keynote speaker. She had joined the Phoenix Police Department the previous year, choosing to follow the path of service that had been inspired by her great-aunt's murder and shaped by her mother's pursuit of justice. "I never met my great-aunt Jennifer," Detective Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that her career was built on a foundation of family tragedy, transformed into public service. "But I grew up hearing stories about her kindness, her dedication to teaching children, her love for her family. I also grew up hearing about Detective Madison Clark, the woman who spent 18 years seeking justice for my family and who inspired my mother to become a prosecutor." Jennifer Martinez had inherited her great-aunt's intelligence and compassion, but she had also inherited the determination that had driven Madison Clark to spend nearly 2 decades refusing to accept that some cases couldn't be solved. She specialized in cases involving violence against families, understanding that every investigation represented someone's daughter, son, mother, or father who deserved justice regardless of how much time had passed since their murder. "The work we do in the Cold Case Unit," Detective Martinez continued, "is built on the understanding that justice has no expiration date. Evidence properly preserved can solve crimes decades after they occur. Families who deserve answers don't stop deserving them just because time passes. And every victim deserves someone who will carry their case forward until the truth is finally revealed."
The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial wall displaying photographs of every victim whose case had been solved by the Cold Case Unit since its creation.
Jennifer Brennan's school photograph occupied the position of honor at the center of the display, surrounded by hundreds of faces representing lives that had been cut short but not forgotten. Families that had found closure through the patient work of investigators inspired by Madison Clark's example. As the crowd dispersed and the evening settled over Phoenix, Detective Jennifer Martinez stood alone before her great-aunt's photograph. She had never known Jennifer Brennan personally, but she had spent her entire life living in the shadow of her murder and the extraordinary investigation that had eventually brought her killer to justice. "I promise I'll carry it forward," Jennifer said quietly, her words meant for an aunt who had died before she was born, but whose legacy had shaped every important decision of her life. "I promise I'll help other families find the answers they deserve." The desert wind carried her words into the darkness, where they joined the countless promises that had been made and kept by 3 generations of investigators who understood that some debts take decades to collect, but they always come due eventually. Marcus Webb was long dead, but the work he had created continued. The families he had destroyed had found healing through justice, and their healing had inspired others to dedicate their lives to ensuring that no murder remained unsolved forever, that no family waited indefinitely for answers, that the dead were never forgotten by those who had sworn to speak for them. In the distance, the lights of Phoenix stretched toward the horizon like a constellation of hope, each point of illumination representing a life that mattered, a story that deserved to be told, a truth that deserved to be discovered. The work continued, carried forward by investigators who understood that every case file represented someone's everything, and that the greatest honor they could offer the dead was to refuse to let their killers remain hidden in darkness forever.